Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. My professionals join me. John Fund of the National Review Online, David Drucker of the Washington Examiner, and Thaddeus McCotter of WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. Gentlemen, the President of the United States and foreign policy are scrambling these last weeks because of the overwhelming pressure of different moving stories. One, the Cardiff, Wales meeting of last week, the 28 members of NATO coming together to discuss Petro Poroshenko in attendance, the elected president of Ukraine. However, the Russian military, in some fashion, supporting rebels who want separation from Ukraine, and their offensive at Mariupol left the NATO meeting in a crisis mode, ceasefire announced while Mr. Obama was there. Remarks afterwards, no clear end to the confrontation between Moscow and Washington, between NATO and the Russian forces. Then, the Islamic State and the murder of Foley and Sotloff and the crisis in Iraq with the government very much overwhelmed by the offensive. That points to a speech within the next days by the president to the nation about what is to be done, what is the strategy, what will Congress say, how will Congress approve, will the approval be narrow or broad? And third, the announcement by the president that there will be no immigration executive action from the Oval Office. This very much disappointing those who had been told, promised, indicated that there would be a decision by the end of summer. Three foreign policy matters. I begin with you, Mr. Drucker, and I very much commend you for your piece on Devin Nunez today. His remarks about the ISIS crisis and the NATO meeting. Your measure, David, the White House, is it overwhelmed? Is it balancing this? Does this gain the president attention with 56, 57 days to election? Good evening, David.
Good evening, John. And I think clearly for most of the summer, at the very least, the White House was overwhelmed. And I think the problem the president was having was that his foreign policy and his outlook as to what the proper foreign policy of the United States should be was not panning out. It wasn't working. He thought if we retreated and had a lighter footprint around the globe, good things would materialize, and instead crises ensue. And so I think that he's reluctantly retooling, in large part, at least when it comes to ISIS and what's going on in Iraq and Syria, because he is receiving enormous pressure from congressional Democrats. And one of the reasons I think this is happening is that, normally foreign policy isn't an issue until it's an issue, until there's a war, until there's an attack, or something of that nature. And this has risen to that level in the eyes of many voters. I was talking to one member of Congress, a Republican, last week who was telling me he polled his district just as a course of normal business, as he does at the end of every August or thereabouts. And the number one issue on the minds of voters, or right up there, was ISIS and what's going on. This thing is registering with the American public, and I think that's why the president, under fire from Democrats, is being forced to come up with a more comprehensive strategy, and that's why we're going to hear from him on Wednesday.
Mr. Fund, your measure of these three foreign policy matters, are they weighing down, are they pulling down the president with 57 days to go?
Well, even voters who do not spend a lot of time on foreign policy get a general sense from the news and the atmosphere of a world that is unstable, in which the United States is no longer directing events, but is responding to events. That creates a feeling of unease, combined with the unease that the economy is still very shaky. Only 10% of the nation's income earners have actually seen gains under Obama. The rest are either stagnant or have lost ground in terms of annual increases in their income. It just adds up to a very unsettled atmosphere, which is never good for the incumbent party trying to hold the Senate.
Thaddeus, your comments.
Well, doesn't this present, in a positive way, a chance for the President of the United States to address a foreign policy issue, namely ISIS, and build consensus within the United States citizenry to show leadership in this instance that could actually have a concomitant, although subordinate, political benefit to himself and his party?
David?
Well, I think the question here is how much about this are we going to hear from the president? Is the nation going to hear from the president after Wednesday's speech? There's the question of what the strategy is going to be, how Syria is or is not going to be included in that strategy. But I think that the president's standard operating procedure with matters like this has been to give a big speech, a detailed speech, and then he doesn't talk about it in public again. And right now we're just talking about ISIS. As John mentioned, we're dealing with Ukraine and Russia, which is an ongoing problem for the administration. And we still don't really know what the administration's response is to that in terms of the fact that so far, every time we escalate sanctions, Vladimir Putin finds a way to ignore them and grab off a little bit more territory.
Your comment, Mr. Fund.
Again, the President of the United States has been flat-footed on all of these issues. If you talk to representatives of governments overseas, they will tell you the President always knew that Europe was going to be slow in responding to Ukraine. It required a strong U.S. response that was not forthcoming. The President had briefings a year ago on the rise of ISIS. He chose to either ignore or backpedal on them. And over again, you see a sense of drift, a sense of uncertainty, a lack of cohesion in U.S. foreign policy. In other words, Carter redux, but worse because it's happening on 3 or 4 fronts rather than just 1 or 2.
Thaddeus, do members of Congress run from foreign policy when it comes to election time?
Well, generally the members of Congress respond to the concerns of the constituents, and that's usually the economy.
Right.
And so when you do have some individuals like Congressman Nunez from California, who's been a leader on intelligence issues, on foreign policy, national security issues for quite some time, he will embrace this. And when people like Devin Nunez embrace an issue and help to drive the message, it makes it much easier for other members to follow.
I'll go to you on that, David. You spoke with Congressman Nunez. Was he saying that this foreign policy crisis, there are several of them, they're moving stories, it was like 2.5 wars. Was he saying that this is dominating the conversation with 57 days to go?
Well, I don't know if it's going to dominate, and I'm not sure that he thinks it will. But it was clear to me in our discussion that he thinks it should. His concern is that whatever we do on the Ukraine, even if we did everything he feels is necessary, had a much more aggressive diplomatic response and a much more aggressive response in terms of aiding Ukraine. He doesn't know that it's going to make a difference at this point. He said it might be too late. And his concern with ISIS is that people don't understand the true nature of the threat. As he put it, this is Al-Qaeda. It's just Al-Qaeda in a much more aggressive, organized form. And he was making the point to me that he felt as though people had somehow bought into the idea that Al-Qaeda was splintered, on the run and on its way out. And he said what they did was find another way, and a better way, in fact, to try and exert their will. He doesn't know if people really understand what's going on, at least as he understands the intelligence.
The final question for you, Thaddeus, and you, Mr. Fund. The president's making the speech on September 10th. Is that an accident, Thaddeus?
I think it's born more of the exigent circumstances in which he finds himself, as I think David and John have both pointed out. The reality has shaken the president's worldview. Again, he's responding to what's happened as a consequence of a policy that he thought was apt, was appropriate, and has now ultimately failed. And he's seen larger problems arise, and so he's got to deal with it as soon as he can feasibly do so.
Mr. Fund, shall I ignore the calendar when the president makes the speech?
Many people will, but many people will not. When people pick up the newspaper or read about the speech the next morning, visions and memories of 9/11 will be there, and the contrast between the unity of the country and the resoluteness with which we were going to confront foreign policy challenges in 2001 and what is happening today will be manifest.
John Fund of the National Review Online, David Drucker of Washington Examiner, Thaddeus McCotter of WJR, Great Voice of the Great Lakes. When we come back, Stu Rothenberg, a very well-known columnist at Roll Call, says there is a wave coming, and the wave is for the Republicans in the Senate. Too much? Too early? We'll ask. I'm John Batchelor.